In 1989, MGM assembled a $21 million cast and crew that included the writer of Blade Runner, the writer of Die Hard, the composer of Alien, the creature effects legend behind Predator, and an Oscar-winning cinematographer. They built a full underwater mining facility on a soundstage in Rome. Then, they released the movie a few months before James Cameron dropped The Abyss, and it was swallowed whole. Released on March 17, 1989, Leviathan stars Peter Weller as Stephen Beck, a geologist overseeing a deep-sea mining crew in a remote ocean floor facility. When a crew member discovers a sunken Soviet freighter and salvages a flask of contaminated vodka, a genetic mutation begins spreading through the crew, transforming them one by one into a massive hybrid creature that absorbs its victims and grows with each kill. Directed by George P. Cosmatos, written by David Webb Peoples and Jeb Stewart, scored by Jerry Goldsmith, and featuring creature effects by Stan Winston, Leviathan had a $21 million budget, one of the most impressive below-the-line crews of 1989, and a release date that placed it in the middle of the most crowded underwater horror season in Hollywood history. It made roughly $15 million at the box office. Today, it's a cult film remembered fondly by those who found it on VHS and forgotten entirely by those who didn't. Here are 12 things you didn't know about Leviathan, the creature feature that assembled legends and still got eaten alive. 1. Leviathan's screenplay was written by two of the most accomplished genre writers working in Hollywood in the 1980s. David Webb Peoples had co-written Blade Runner in 1982 and would go on to write Unforgiven and 12 Monkeys. Jeb Stewart had just written Die Hard in 1988 and would follow it with The Fugitive. Together, they were working from Peoples' original story, which in its initial draft featured tiny insect-like creatures that escaped from a bottle and entered the crew's bodies before the concept was scaled up to a singular, massive hybrid creature. Think about that pedigree. Blade Runner, Die Hard, those aren't just good movies, they're two of the most influential films of the decade. When you hand a creature feature script to those two writers, you expect something with genuine intelligence behind it. And Leviathan does have that. There's sharp corporate cynicism in the film, a real sense of economic desperation in the crew, and some genuinely interesting ideas about mutation and identity. But here's the problem. Even the best writers can't escape genre gravity when the producers want alien underwater. What's fascinating though is that People's original insect concept was actually more original than what got made. The tiny creature idea that gets inside you and changes you from within is scarier and more personal than a giant fish monster. By the time the script was done, the insect was gone, and what remained was brilliant talent producing competent homage. That's not the writer's fault. That's the gravitational pull of commerce. 2. George P. Cosmatos directed Leviathan after back-to-back Sylvester Stallone vehicles, Rambo: First Blood Part 2 in 1985, and Cobra in 1986. He had signed a 5-year production deal with the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group and was originally slated to direct an action film called China Marines, which was canceled. When Leviathan was pitched to him, he was drawn to the opportunity to make a suspenseful horror picture. Territory completely different from the bullet-riddled spectacles he'd been making. He would later direct Tombstone in 1993. Cosmatos is a fascinating figure in this story because he's both the right director and potentially the wrong director for this material. He absolutely knows how to stage action. The creature attack sequences in Leviathan move with confidence, and the above-water finale has genuine momentum. But horror requires a different skill set than action. Horror is about restraint, pacing, and letting the audience's imagination do the heavy lifting. Action is about delivering the spectacle as directly as possible. Cosmatos' instinct was always towards the spectacle, which is why the crew was frustrated by the editing. Stan Winston's team built one of the most remarkable creature suits of 1989, and Cosmatos cuts away from it so often that you never get a clean look. Action editing works in action films. In horror, hiding the monster is usually better, but not when you've built a masterpiece of practical effects and your cuts are just confusing rather than suspenseful. That tension between action instincts and horror needs defined Leviathan's greatest. This is legitimately impressive filmmaking. Dry for wet was a standard technique in the era, but pulling it off well requires extraordinary discipline from every department simultaneously. The actors have to move slow, flowing ways. Hair has to ripple correctly. Clothes have to billow. The lighting has to suggest refraction. Cinematographer Alex Thompson, Oscar nominated and genuinely one of the best in the business, makes most of it convincing. And the multi-infinity pool trick for the finale is genuinely clever. The irony is that James Cameron was doing the exact opposite at the same time. The Abyss was filming in an actual nuclear reactor cooling tank containing 6.5 million gallons of real water in South Carolina, and it nearly killed the entire production. Both approaches were trying to solve the same visual problem. Cameron's solution was technically authentic and financially and physically ruinous. Cosmatos' solution was economically sensible and visually effective. Leviathan just had to live in Cameron's shadow anyway. 4. Stan Winston, fresh off Aliens and Predator, was brought in to design and build Leviathan's creature effects. His team submitted between 50 and 60 separate concept drawings exploring what the creature might look like. All of those designs were ultimately combined. Qualities from multiple sketches merged into a single final design, producing a massive fish-headed hybrid with dagger-like teeth and the ability to visibly absorb and incorporate the physical characteristics of its victims. Tom Woodruff Jr., who had worn the Alien Queen suit in Aliens, wore the Leviathan creature suit. Director Cosmatos gave Winston's team significant creative autonomy, frequently deferring to their expertise on how the creature should be presented. Stan Winston's involvement here cannot be overstated. In 1989, this man's resume included The Terminator, Aliens, and Predator. He was the undisputed master of practical creature effects in Hollywood. The fact that his team generated 50 to 60 concept drawings, not sketches, full drawings, for a single creature tells you the level of commitment involved. The final creature is genuinely impressive. The body horror mutation sequences, where crew members partially fuse with the creature, are still disturbing today. Tom Woodruff Jr. wearing the suit is full commitment practical filmmaking. The tragedy is that the creature Winston built deserved a film that showed it off better. The Stan Winston studio crew reportedly felt frustrated by the final edit. After 4 months in Rome building one of the most complex creature suits of the era, they were watching a movie where you could never quite see what they made. That's the gap between craft and commerce. Winston built a masterpiece. The film didn't know how to exhibit it. 5. To prepare for the aquatic setting of the film, members of Stan Winston's creature effects crew learned to scuba dive while living in Rome during the 4-month production. Several team members enjoyed it so much that they maintained scuba diving as a hobby long after filming ended. This is notable because the film's underwater sequences were shot dry on sound stages, meaning the effects crew learned to dive for a film where almost nothing was filmed underwater. This fact is either the most absurd or the most charming detail in Leviathan's production history, depending on your mood. Stan Winston's team spends 4 months in Rome, learns scuba diving to prepare for an underwater film, and then shoots the whole thing on a dry soundstage. They're practicing for conditions they'll never actually encounter on set. But here's the thing, there's something genuinely good-natured about it. These are the craftspeople who took their assignment seriously, so seriously enough that they wanted to understand the actual physical experience their creature would supposedly be operating in, even if the scuba skills went unused professionally. The knowledge of how bodies move in water, how things drift and float, that probably informed how they designed the creature's movements. And hey, they got 4 months in Rome and learned to scuba dive. That's not the worst consolation prize for making a movie that got crushed by the Abyss. 6. The production design for Leviathan was created by Ron Cobb, the conceptual designer who had designed the Nostromo and much of the Alien visual universe for Ridley Scott in 1979. Cobb also designed the DeLorean time machine for Back to the Future. His design for the tri-oceanic deep-sea mining facility in Leviathan became what critics described as a near exemplar of 1980s sci-fi futurism: functional, claustrophobic, and filled with the kind of industrial detail that makes an impossible environment feel lived in and real. Ron Cobb designing the Leviathan station is perhaps the single most fascinating piece of behind-the-scenes trivia this film has. This is the man who gave Alien its iconic industrial visual language: the heavy machinery, the exposed conduits, the sense that the Nostromo was a working vessel rather than a fantasy spacecraft. That same sensibility runs through every frame of the tri-oceanic station. It looks real. It looks like somewhere actual human beings would actually work at the bottom of the ocean. The production design is arguably the most durable achievement in the entire film. 25 years later, people who watch Leviathan for the first time comment on how convincing the station feels. That's Ron Cobb. That's what happens when you hire the person who literally defined what utilitarian sci-fi looks like. The production design alone is a reason enough to watch this movie. It's a masterclass in world building through craft rather than spectacle. 7. The film's score was composed by Jerry Goldsmith, who had previously worked with Cosmatos on The Cassandra Crossing in 1976 and Rambo: First Blood Part 2 in 1985. To capture the isolation and alien quality of the deep sea setting, Goldsmith sampled recordings of humpback whales and wove them into the orchestral score alongside synthesizers and a full orchestra, the Orchestra di Santa Cecilia, recorded in Rome. The resulting score has been described as polarizing, experimental, and genuinely unusual, with the whale sounds creating an otherworldly undertone beneath conventional horror orchestration. Jerry Goldsmith composing the score for a movie like Leviathan is another example of extraordinary talent doing extraordinary work for a film that never quite met them at their level. This is the man who scored Alien, The Omen, Chinatown, and Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And he doesn't just phone it in for a B-grade creature feature. He goes full experimental, sampling actual whale vocalizations and building them into an orchestra. That's creative risk-taking. The whale sounds create this genuinely disturbing effect where you can't always tell if what you're hearing is a score or something alive in the water around the station. It makes the ocean itself feel hostile and aware, which is exactly right thematically. Critics who reviewed the score in isolation generally appreciate it. The film itself got dismissed as derivative, but the score is a legitimate piece of experimental horror composition. It's the kind of work that deserves better than that weird underwater monster movie from 1989. 8. Leviathan was produced as an American-Italian co-production through MGM and Filmaro, the production company of Luigi and Aurelio De Laurentiis, the older brother and nephew of legendary producer Dino De Laurentiis. The Italian co-production structure resulted in significant cultural friction on set. Stan Winston's creature effects lead mechanic Richard Landon kept a meticulous equipment log where he frequently replaced written descriptions with sketches of nuts and bolts and hardware components, because communicating technical requirements across the language barrier through text alone proved unworkable. American crew members also noted that Italian crew members routinely consumed alcohol during the workday. The image of a Stan Winston creature effects mechanic drawing little sketches of bolts in his equipment log because he can't communicate in Italian is deeply endearing. These are the human moments that never make it into the making of documentaries, but tell you everything about what production is actually like. You've got this legendary effects crew, fresh off Aliens, Predator, months of complex fabrication, trying to source specific hardware components in Rome while working in a second language with suppliers who've never built a fish monster suit before. The solution was elementary school level communication. Draw pictures of the thing you need. That's practical creativity under constraint. The Italian crew alcohol note is also fascinating, not because it's scandalous, but because it illustrates how deeply cultural the experience of making movies is. The same behavior that's completely unremarkable in one production culture is disorienting in another. Leviathan was genuine antagonist, defined by inadequacy rather than competence. Weller plays this with the same weary intelligence he brought to RoboCop, and the performance is considerably more nuanced than the movie around him. What's interesting about Weller's work in Leviathan is that it's genuinely good in a film where good acting wasn't necessarily the priority. Beck is written as someone who's in over his head, literally and figuratively, and Weller doesn't make him more heroic than the script intends. He's exhausted, uncertain, visibly scared. In a different film, with a stronger director, that performance could have been the emotional anchor of something really memorable. Instead, it's the best thing in a movie that never quite decides what it wants to be. Weller understood what Leviathan was trying to do even when the film itself didn't. His final moment, punching the corporate villain in the face after surviving the monster, plays like pure catharsis, and he earns it. It's the most satisfying beat in the movie, and it works entirely because of how he plays that 90 minutes before it. 10. 1989 produced an inexplicable cluster of major underwater horror and science fiction films. Deep Star 6 opened on January 13th. Leviathan followed on March 17th. James Cameron's The Abyss arrived on August 9th. All three were big budget productions from major studios. All three were competing for the same audience in the same calendar year. Deep Star 6 cost $8 million and made roughly $8 million. Leviathan cost $21 million and made roughly $15 million. The Abyss cost $70 million and made $90 million worldwide, won 4 Academy Awards, and is considered one of the greatest underwater films ever made. Leviathan and Deep Star 6 were effectively forgotten before The Abyss had even opened. The 1989 underwater arms race is one of the most bizarre episodes in Hollywood history. Nobody planned it. Studios developing films independently, release dates set without awareness of what competitors were doing, and somehow all 3 major underwater genre films landed in a 6-month window. The timing destroyed Leviathan specifically because of the sequencing. Deep Star 6 came first, which established the underwater creature horror brand in audiences' minds before Leviathan even arrived. Leviathan was marginally better than Deep Star 6, but arrived looking like the second version of the same thing. Then, The Abyss arrived and made everything before it look like rough drafts. If Leviathan had come out in 1987 or even 1990, it would have existed on its own terms and found its audience. Instead, it arrived in the exact wrong year, sandwiched between the wrong competition. That's not a creative failure, that's pure bad luck amplified by studio timing. 11. Alec Gillis and Tom Woodruff Jr., 2 of Stan Winston's key creature effects artists on Leviathan, moved directly from the Leviathan production to work on Tremors in 1990. Woodruff Jr., who had worn the Leviathan creature suit, went on to become one of the most respected creature suit performers and effects designers in the industry, co-founding Amalgamated Dynamics Inc. with Gillis and creating effects for films including Alien 3, Tremors, and dozens of others. Their time in Rome on Leviathan was effectively the beginning of their independent careers. This is one of those beautiful Hollywood through lines. Leviathan, the film that got buried, served as a launching pad for 2 of the most important practical effects artists of the next decade. Gillis and Woodruff took what they learned building the Leviathan creature, walked directly into Tremors, and helped create the Graboids, one of the most beloved practical monster designs in modern horror history. The craft doesn't disappear when the film fails, the skills transfer, the work compounds. Leviathan looks different when you understand that every choice Stan Winston's team made in Rome, every bolt sketch in the equipment log, every scuba lesson, every one of those 50 concept drawings fed into the accumulated knowledge that produced Tremors, Alien 3, and the next generation of practical effects. Failed films don't produce failed craftspeople. They produce, instead, staring out from its body. That's something different. That's not monster eats people horror. That's transformational horror. The creature in Leviathan is a collection of people who no longer exist independently, fused into something that isn't any of them. That's a genuinely disturbing idea with real philosophical weight. It asks what the self is, whether identity survives transformation, and what it means to be consumed so completely that you become part of something that hunts the people you used to know. Alien asks, what if there was a perfect predator? Leviathan asks, what if there was a creature that turned you into itself? Those aren't the same question. Leviathan deserves better than alien underwater. It was trying to be something stranger than that. It didn't always succeed, but it was trying. Leviathan made roughly $15 million on a $21 million budget. It was sandwiched between Deep Star 6 and The Abyss in the worst possible release window. Critics dismissed it as alien underwater. The effects crew was frustrated by editing that hid their work, and yet, a writer of Blade Runner, a composer who sampled humpback whales, a designer who built the Nostromo, a creature effects team that went on to make Tremors, an Oscar-winning cinematographer shooting on stages in Rome. That's not a bad film. That's a film that was outrun by its own production context. Leviathan's real failure isn't the film itself. It's that it arrived at the exact moment when James Cameron was about to raise the bar so high that everything else in the genre looked like it was standing still. That's not the crew's fault. That's just history. So here's my question for you. Is Leviathan an underrated gem buried by bad timing? Or a well-made disappointment that never transcended its influences? And which of the three 1989 underwater films holds up best today? Drop your verdict in the comments. Next week, I'm covering The Fly, Cronenberg's body horror masterpiece that nobody in Hollywood wanted to make. Hit subscribe if you want more 80s horror that deserves the autopsy. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the monster isn't the thing in the water. Sometimes it's the calendar.